So a little while ago I managed to get my hands on a very good deal on the Blackmagic Pocket Cinema Camera. And I'm not talking about the Pocket 4K or the 6K, I'm talking about the original Blackmagic Pocket Cinema Camera. I managed to get a great deal on this because the internal batteries wasn't working. But if you know anything about the pocket cameras, even the new 4K or 6K, the internal batteries are really bad. And you're probably gonna use some kind of external power anyway. So I just got this camera for really cheap by using an external battery, which was kinda needed anyway. And that intro was shot entirely on the Blackmagic Pocket Cinema Camera, by the way. Except for the shot off the pocket camera, of course. Even though it's almost 8 years old, it shoots 1080p in ProRes or RAW internally to SD cards, uses log picture profiles with 13 stops of dynamic range. That's just impressive. The Pocket Cinema Camera uses a Super 16mm sensor with a Micro Four Thirds mount. The Super 16mm sensor could be seen as a pro or a con depending on which lenses you're using the camera with. If you're a fan of old vintage lenses and want to use some Super 16mm lenses, then obviously the Super 16mm sensor is a pro. But Super 16mm sensor has a crop factor of 2.88 compared to a full frame camera. That means if you have lenses that you normally use on a full frame camera or a APS-C/Super 35mm camera, then most of those lenses will probably be very telephoto, so you'll have to look into getting some wider lenses. And I actually have a Speedbooster on my pocket camera, which brings down the crop from 2.88 down to roughly 2. So effectively this camera now has a Micro Four Thirds sensor size instead. We can talk about camera specs all day, but in the end, it's the images that the camera produces that are far more important than the specs on a spec sheet. I mean, sure, the camera doesn't have 4K, but even an Alexa Mini doesn't have a native 4K sensor. The Blackmagic Pocket Cinema Camera produces an image that just, it has character in some sense. And if you pair it with vintage lenses, you just get that, I'm not a fan of the word, but film look, a cinematic image in some sense. It's called the Pocket Cinema Camera, and it doesn't have that typical video look. It looks more like cinema. And to get that for such a low price, I mean, that's awesome. It has pocket in the name, but the way I would use the camera, it wouldn't fit in a pocket. I would add some weight to the camera. I would add a battery, I would add a monitor. I mean, I would rig it up a bit to get some weight, because just using the camera as it is, handheld with a non-stabilized lens, you will get those ugly micro jitters. You know when you can see something's been filmed with a DSLR because of that tiny shake. By adding some weight to the camera, you will remove that micro jitter, because a heavier camera is a camera that's less prone to movement. It's physics. So when I use the camera, I normally put it into my rig, which I made a video about here. And basically it's just, I have a cage, I have a monitor, I have a top handle, and it just makes the camera much easier to use. Or if you prefer a shoulder mounted camera, you can obviously use it on a shoulder rig as well. The camera shoots in both RAW and ProRes, and in ProRes you have different flavors. You can use ProRes HQ, 422, LT or Proxy. In the RAW format that the camera shoots in is Cinema DNG, which is basically just a bunch of RAW stills in a folder. If you shoot in RAW and edit or color grade in Resolve, you can actually use the newer version 4 color science of the Blackmagic design film, which is the same that's being used in the Pocket 4K or 6K, which makes it much easier to match those cameras. Of course it won't look exactly the same because there are different sensors, but it will get you much closer. And as I said, the camera isn't the easiest to use, and that also applies to media, SD cards. The camera is very picky about what cards you can and can't use. Some might work with only ProRes, some might work with ProRes and RAW, and if you go to Blackmagic's official site, you'll find a list of the compatible cards. But basically it's the Sandisk Extreme Pro if you want to shoot in RAW. And from what I've seen online, the newer versions of the card don't really work if you want to shoot in RAW, so you have to get the old versions which are discontinued, so you probably have to find them used. I managed to pick up 3 64GB cards for pretty cheap, but it's still quite annoying to have to get separate cards just for this camera. And to compare it more to a cinema camera, the way ISO works is quite similar to the way it works in an Arri Alexa, for example. The camera always captures the full 13 stops of dynamic range. What happens when you change the ISO is, within those 13 stops, where is middle gray placed? The native ISO is 800, and while using 800 you have a pretty good balance between highlight latitude and shadow detail. But when changing the ISO, you change how much latitude you have either above or below middle gray. And this makes quite a lot of sense if you ever try out shooting RAW, because when you're shooting RAW you can change the ISO later on in post. But what happens is you still have the same amount of dynamic range. If I change from ISO 800 to 400, the image just gets darker. I don't gain any information in the highlight or in the shadows. The image just gets darker. So what would happen if I shot at 400 instead of 800? Well, while shooting I would notice that my image was one stop underexposed. I would then add one more stop of light by either opening up the aperture or adding more light. So by adding one more stop of light to the image, I would then lose one stop of highlight information but instead gain one stop of shadow detail. And when looking at it this way, it makes quite a lot of sense. So if you're trying to shoot a scene that is really dark, you shouldn't up your ISO to get the image brighter. Instead, it would be more beneficial to use a lower ISO and instead add more light to the scene. That way you would get more information in the shadows. And on the opposite end, if you're outside and want to keep highlight information, you shouldn't lower the ISO, you should instead cut the amount of light reaching the sensor, either by an ND filter or the aperture. That might take some time to wrap your head around, but I would probably just leave it at the native ISO 800 for most of the time, unless I know why I'm changing it. So for who would I recommend this camera? It's not for vloggers, obviously. This isn't a vlogging camera. It has cinema in its name. I think this camera would be great for up-and-coming cinematographers or people who want to get into the art of cinematography, because the camera doesn't help you in any way. It's not the easiest camera to use. To change the white balance you have to go into the menu. There are no auto anything, but that's why it's such a good camera, because the camera doesn't help you. It forces you to make the decisions. You have to be the cinematographer. You create the images, the camera just captures them. You decide where to focus, you decide how to expose, how to white balance, because those are your creative tools as a cinematographer to tell the story that you want to tell and to create the images that you want to create. And for that, I love this camera. And that pretty much wraps it up for today. Like the video if you liked it, subscribe if you want to see some more, and I'll see you next time.